Yeah, the blog, the good thing about the blog is it gets me into trouble regularly. And I'm in trouble at the moment because I said something which was not terribly progressive on gender and well-being. I went along and talked to Gallup poll on last Friday, and they do this world poll on women and on well-being. They ask people how they feel about their lives. It's very rigorous methodology, and they found out that and they did it by gender disaggregation, and they found out that the 4 countries where women are disproportionately happier than men are Qatar, Iran, Angola, and South Korea, right? And so I thought that was really interesting, and I blogged about it, and now all the feminists in Oxfam are really upset, and they're giving me a very hard time. So if you have fun on a blog, you should get into trouble regularly, and I have fun. Okay, so the book that has already been stolen was an attempt to construct an NGO narrative on development, which is a crazy attempt. It got very long, because everybody has a different view on things. But it was a really interesting conversation. It involved about 500 people in the first edition, and now I've just had to do a second edition. And what that means is that you can go back and see how wrong you were 5 years ago. If you went back and looked at one of your essays 5 years ago, predicting what was going to happen next, it's a painful experience. So I'm going to sort of talk about what's changed in the last 5 years. And this is from a point of view of somebody based in the UK. It's very much kind of international NGO view of development. I know very little about India. I'll be talking in great generalizations, quite a lot about Africa and Latin America as well as Asia. The kind of overriding message of the first edition was that you need these 2 things, active citizens and effective states. And it's when those 2 exist and interact that you can get very fast, well-rounded development in the Amartya Sen sense of the word, of freedoms to be and to do. If you just want very fast rising GDP per capita, then actually effective states are the bit you need. And if you want lots of rights, and you want lots of kind of active expression, then you need active citizens. But if you want development to proceed, you need both. And that was a kind of obvious message, but actually quite a difficult one for a lot of NGOs who believe in the active citizen part, or a lot of governments that believe in the effective states part. So it was worth bringing the 2 together. A message from that first edition was that inequality is the subject we need to think more about. Along with how change happens, that organizations like Oxfam describe themselves as change agents, but actually they have very little idea of why changes happen when they do, in the way they do, or how to influence them. So it was trying to systematize what we know and what we don't know about how change happens. And being an author, as I said, is a nightmare. What you do when you go back to your first edition, for those who get into the book writing business, is you scour the text for the thing that you can claim predicted what happened next. So I found storm clouds over the world economy was the only phrase I used to describe the global meltdown, but at least it was there, and that means that I can then claim that I foresaw everything that happened since. So it saves you in the end. What's changed since 2008? In very crude terms, I'm going to talk about what's changed in the world outside, and then what's changed in the way we think about development. Again, I feel very English here. What we think about development in the UK development community, I think I'll say that. The first thing, obviously, global financial crisis. If you can read the cartoon, he wasn't a lot of fun before he lost confidence in the world financial system. The global financial crisis hangs like a cloud over Europe in particular. Everybody's permanently depressed, unless you're Greek or Spanish, in which case you're permanently angry. But it's certainly become this huge kind of depressing thing, which conditions the way we think. And people in Oxfam in the UK constantly talk about the global economic crisis. And I have to keep saying, actually, it's not completely global yet. It's actually quite European and North American. That's something that we have discussions about. Food prices. So this is, we did a big piece of cross-country research on food prices, doing good, qualitative, rigorous work, doing discussions with women in particular in rural and urban communities around a number of countries. And the most useful thing anyone did was take a photograph. a researcher off their own initiative got a group of women in Zambia to put together what they could have bought a year before and then what they could buy this year with the same amount of money, which really graphically demonstrates the impact of that very sudden rise in food prices in 2008-9. And since then, we've had another spike in 2011, and we may have another one coming. So that's caused in many countries, it's had a far bigger impact on poor people than the global financial crisis. It just didn't get the headlines. And the Arab Spring. So we have two bad shocks and a good shock so far. So the Arab Spring, completely unpredictable, made us think very differently about change, about the role of women in predominantly Muslim societies, in citizens' movement in North Africa and the Middle East. It changed a lot of the way we thought about development in general. So let's talk about that, new thinking. Some of these are things which we do actually think. Some of these are things we may one day think about. And some of them are things we should think about but are not. So there's a bit of a mixture here. One of the things we are thinking about is, where are poor people? Okay, it's kind of obvious, especially if you live here. But in the past, poor people lived in low-income countries. It was very simple. Poor countries, poor people, same thing. Solution, aid, poverty reduction, all nice and straightforward. Now, because of the upgrading of countries like India, 80% of poor people live in middle-income countries. And that's a really different debate, because then the solution to poverty becomes much more internal. It becomes about internal equity, social contract between different groups in society, taxation, role of the government, a very different sort of agenda to the low-income country agenda. And looking down the line, increasingly, poverty is going to become concentrated in fragile and conflict states, which is the place where it's hardest to do anything about it. So working in development is just going to get more and more impossible over the next 20 years. But that's the way it's going. And some of those fragile states are low income, some are middle income, but they're all a mess. I think there's been a lot of progress on gender in the development discussion in the last 5 years. You've had the creation of UN Women, which has a bigger voice than all the separate agencies that were working on gender issues and women's issues before. You've had the World Development Report, the World Bank's most important publication last year on gender and inequality, which was pretty unthinkable 10 years ago. But the discussion on women and development has become stuck in a kind of instrumental version of, how do we make women contribute more? How do we get them to go to work, be more active as citizens, raise their families, and not sleep very much? And that's it's a kind of instrumental view of women, and there's been much less discussion on how do you make development more compatible with women's needs. So very little discussion on the care economy. How do we value, how do we build the care economy into our policy-making process, for example? There was a great, yeah, I'll leave it there. What is poverty anyway? In Washington, in London, up until 10 years ago, there was still, I think, a majority unthinking sort of default discussion on poverty of income poverty. $1 a day, $2 a day, $1.25. A lot of discussion about methodology, really sort of, people trying to get as accurate a picture as they could of income poverty. The effect of those huge shocks, both the financial shock, the food price shock, and in our own experience, the increasing prevalence of climate-related shocks, has meant we're thinking much more about volatility, things going up and down rather than averages, vulnerability, when something goes up and down, are you going to be badly affected or are you okay? And then the risk, so how do you reduce the risk of being affected by these shocks when they occur? And that's made us think about resilience, the latest buzzword in a lot of development circles. How do you think of the development as a system where communities can withstand shocks and bounce back or improve rather than go into a downward spiral? And in practice, that's led to a lot of thinking about social protection, safety nets, climate change adaptation. How do we build in dampeners on things like food prices and financial markets? So a whole range of different instruments to try and reduce shocks and increase resilience. The reason I'm here partly is because there's an enormous conference going on at the Ashok Hotel in Delhi on well-being. The OECD, India's not a member of the OECD, right? No, okay, well, it's hosting it anyway. It's very strange. India's hosting an OECD conference on how do you measure well-being. And in this one, the governments are way ahead of the NGOs. Governments around the world are actually trying to measure quality of life because GDP is a really bad proxy. And the last one of these was in South Korea a couple of years ago. And the Korean host said, look, we tell our people that Korea is the development success story. You know, GDP per capita has tripled in our lifetime. And yet we have the highest suicide rate and the lowest birth rate in the OECD. Clearly someone is wrong, and it's not the people. You know, there's something wrong with the statistical project. So there's a huge investment at official level, at academic level, and to a much lesser extent in terms of NGOs and the aid business, in how do you actually measure this stuff? How do you know whether people are happier or less happy? People say that, yeah, the calculation is that the total number of people worldwide who live on less than $1.25 a day is about 1.4 billion. Okay? So a little bit more than the population of India. But actually only about 300 to 400 million of those are permanently under $1.25. Everybody else is churning up and down. Yeah, they're doing well one season or 1 year, they go down the next, the cow dies, someone gets married, something terrible happens like that, and suddenly everybody goes down. The 300 or 400 million people who are chronically poor are actually different from the billion who are churning up and down. It's the disabled, the elderly, the people who live in remote areas, indigenous minorities. So it's a very different group, and it's much harder to help that group with growth, with just market development. So there's a clear distinction being made between how do we help with the chronically poor, which requires a high level of state intervention, and how do we work with transitory poverty, where it's much more about overall development of this economy and society. Politically, I think it's just been an amazing few years. It's been incredibly interesting to watch the global centre of gravity shift at a speed. I'm not a historian, so I don't know when, except perhaps with the rise of Hitler, that and I'm not making comparisons, that the shift in global strength has gone from one group of countries to another. So in 2009, straight after the crisis, the G8 basically shut up shop and said, we now formally hand on the baton to the G20. The G20 ran with the baton for a couple of years and then lied down to have a little sleep. So you now have a situation where no one's actually leading the global economy. There's a kind of G0 phenomenon going on. But into that vacuum are lots of shifting alliances. So if you look at Syria, there's a group of 4 neighbor countries taking action on Syria. Turkey and Brazil tried to come up with a solution to Iran nuclear problem. There's lots of different alliances. It's a complete nightmare for any organisation to follow. We used to, Oxfam International used to go to one G8 summit. We knew what to do. We knew who to talk to. We had a way of dealing with it. Then you go to the next G8 summit. Then we started going to the G20 summits, and now it's all got much more complicated. And you actually have to follow international distribution of power and alliances much more closely than we used to have to. I think what is clear is that with the kind of paralysis of a lot of the multilateral system, so trade is stuck, arms trade negotiations are stuck, financial reform is half stuck, climate change is very stuck. We are not seeing a dynamic international system. We are seeing that most of the interesting stuff that is happening is still at national level. And the argument of the book, which was kind of controversial in Europe, not controversial here, is that NGOs like Oxfam have massively exaggerated the importance of global processes. So we had a campaign in 2005 which was hailed as a great campaign called Make Poverty History. And it was actually a really silly campaign because it said if you sort out aid debt and trade, you will make poverty history, which is just ridiculous. You make poverty history by building social contracts at national level, national development, growth, distribution, social services. None of that. Aid, debt and trade is secondary to all of those things. So this is, I still think that what we've seen in the last 5 years reaffirms that all the global and international stuff is a second order issue when you look at development. Demography. So if you wanted to sort of caricature the development mindset of NGOs in the rich countries, not Oxfam India, I hasten to add, I work for Oxfam GB. Everything I say should not be taken to criticise Oxfam India. I should have said that at the beginning. It's very nice of them to invite me here, etc., etc. They probably never invite me again. The basic idea is that people in poor countries have lots of kids, all right? And that's not a good thing. Women want to have fewer kids. We'll support family planning, but that's basically the system. And they don't have many old people. And we're the reverse. We don't have enough kids. We have lots of old people. And that's becoming less and less a fair picture. So globally, we've reached peak child. Okay, you've heard of peak oil, when the world gets to maximum production of oil and then it starts to fall. We've now reached maximum production of children globally, and it's starting to fall. Okay. Migration, no one stays in the same place very much. International flows are very important. The flow of remittances from international workers is now 3 times the volume of global aid, and is actually much more resistant to crises and all the rest of it. In 2008-9, it sort of stopped for a year, and then it just carried on rising at 15% a year, like it always does. And with that comes more political influence, a lot of interest in the role of diasporas. Migration is changing a lot of different things. We have youth bulges, sudden sort of large cohorts of teenagers getting qualified and then not getting jobs and getting very frustrated, which were at the heart of the Arab Spring. But you've also got age bulges, so you've got a very fast demographic transition. There are 50 countries in the world which aren't replacing their own populations. Okay? The fastest falling population is Iran, 1.2 children per woman in Iran, right? Incredibly low. The replacement rate is 2.1. 17 of those 50 countries are developing countries. Often they don't have welfare systems in place to deal with an aging population, and they're going to go get an aging population very quickly. So you've seen a sudden rush in East Asia to put pension systems in place. Like hundreds of millions of people being signed up every year in China to new pension systems. Not all countries are thinking ahead like China, but this is a big. We talk about development in the UK as a kind of baby problem. It's going to be an old person problem in about 20, 30 years in most countries. A lot of other issues are kind of, this is in the development mindset again, I hasten to add. In the development mindset, you have our problems and their problems, right? Their problems are hunger, water and sanitation, education, health, infectious diseases, right? Our problems are what to do about disabled people, what to do about mental health, what to do about road traffic, what to do about congestion, pollution, all the rest of it. Increasingly, we're realizing that they're all mixed and everybody's got this. The most obese country in the world is the US. The second most obese country in the world is Mexico, right? With a massive problem of heart disease, diabetes, a whole range of stuff. And it's coming, I'm told, to India quite fast too. So you've got, and this is actually something that we can help with because we've got experience in dealing with, in reducing road traffic accidents. Road traffic kills more people worldwide than malaria. Tobacco kills 6 times more people than malaria. And we've got experience with this stuff. It's not on the development agenda, which is a bit strange. Waves of technology. NGOs are terrible at technology. We basically don't like it. Yeah. So don't quote me on that. But there are nice technologies and nasty technologies. Nice technologies are PowerPoint, which we love, mobile phones, internet, conference calls. That's all good. Almost everything else is nasty. So we don't like GM. We don't like, nuclear. We don't like, we don't even know what nanotech is, but we probably don't like it. And this is crazy because technology is a really important part of development. And I am fairly depressed about the possibility of Oxfam or anyone else in that world getting it on technology. I did physics at college a long time ago, so it particularly pisses me off. Okay, aid. I realise this is entirely irrelevant to aid to India, except that India has become an aid donor. But globally, aid still matters, especially in some of the very poor countries. And this is a piece of research by the World Bank on what happened after a banking crisis. In about 25 cases, banking crises in rich countries. And what they showed is that aid continued to rise for a couple of years and then went into this 15-year trough. And that's pretty much what's happening now. We've just reached the top and it's just started going down. And I think it's best to assume, this is history, it's not destiny, but it's best to assume that aid is going to fall. What's definite is that it's becoming less important as a percentage of government revenues. So I was talking to some ministers in Uganda, in Africa, a few years ago, and they said, we used to rely 60% of our government budget came from aid, 60%, and we had to go on 2 knees to the World Bank. And now we only rely on aid for 30%. So I made the obvious joke and said, so you just go on 1 knee to the World Bank? And they were not happy. I didn't get invited back, but, it was making a point. Okay, the other thing which we've really started to think about is environment. So I think when I wrote the book in 2007, my main feeling about the environment was that I find environmentalists really annoying. Okay, they're very pleased with themselves. They think if they recycle stuff, they're going to save the world. They don't think about politics. That is all still true. Environmentalists are still very annoying and very apolitical. But they're also right, which is even more annoying. And the one thing which has really changed is that I can't really believe it, but we've essentially thought of the planet as an infinitely large open system. Yeah, obviously if we'd been asked, we would have said that was ridiculous, but that was our working assumption, that you could just grow, and technology would somehow sort out any problems of externalities like climate change. And increasingly we realise that that's not just going to happen automatically, that we have to consider the ecosystem, the global ecosystem, as a space with boundaries. And this is some interesting work from a group of scientists in Stockholm who tried to work out what are the real system boundaries to the Earth as a single ecological system. And they came up with 9, and they showed that we've breached the boundaries in 2 or 3 of them. And they said that's what we've got to do, that's what we've got to learn to live within that space. And so we looked at that and said, well, that's fine, but there's no people in here. And there's no inequality in here, and there's no social justice in here. So a colleague of mine at Oxfam called Kate Rayworth has been trying to fit a social floor, a minimum level of social dignity inside the planetary boundaries, and she's come up with something that looks like a donut. So inside are all the things that matter for a decent life, or most of them. You could add to that list, but that's the principle. And the trick is, can we live above the floor and inside the boundaries, i.e. inside the donut? And she's got a blog on donut economics. She's doing donut seminars everywhere. And what we're very keen on doing, this is basically just a framework for thinking, and it's very global. And we want to see if this makes sense at national and subnational levels. So the next stage in thinking this through is would this mean that we do anything differently at national or subnational level? And we're doing some work in Brazil, in a couple of other countries, and it'd be great if we could do it in India as well. Finally, the way we think has changed. Anybody recognize this slide? Anybody working on conflict here? This is the US military's mental map of Afghanistan. Okay? And it's actually quite good. It also kind of explains why the US military is leaving Afghanistan. But it's actually quite good. It's a decent attempt to work out who is important, how they're linked, what the hell's going on in that country. And what it shows, you have to sing a song. Anyone whose mobile goes off has to stand up and sing a song. Is that okay? No, joking, sorry. Sometimes people do, and that's even worse. Okay. All right, so So, where was I? Oh, yes. So when you look at that, yeah, your question as a NGO, as a development agency, as the US military, so what do we do? All right? And I think it's quite useful to keep that in your mind when you're thinking, what do we do? Because what it suggests is that a nice linear chain of cause and effect is highly unlikely. That if we do X, we think we are going to achieve Y, and we're going to monitor it and evaluate it, and then we're going to report back to DFID or the World Bank about how well we achieved Y. You're probably living in some kind of fantasy world in many situations. And that's quite right, quite fine, because most of the aid industry lives in a fantasy world, and it constructs mythical cause and effect chains in order to be able to justify its money, but just don't pretend it's reality. So this thinking is making us think much more about how change happens, which is my current kind of big area of work in the next book. A lot of change is discontinuous. You can bang away on your campaign or your education program for years, nothing happens, and then suddenly, often for reasons which are very hard to understand, it'll take off, something big happens. Sometimes it's quite easy to understand. Somebody's changed jobs, there's a financial scandal and government is suddenly looking for new ideas. There's been a natural disaster and they've messed it up. All sorts of discontinuous shocks are linked to discontinuous change. But much of it is unpredictable. The Arab Spring famously took off because a guy called Mohammed Bouazizi set fire to himself in protest at having his scales taken away. He was a street vendor, taking his scales taken away by a woman police officer. Okay, so it was a horrible mix of outrage at being humiliated by a woman, outrage at being humiliated, frustration that he had to live as a street vendor and had a really hard life, and he set fire to himself. He had enough friends who were using Facebook and Twitter for it to spread very quickly, and the Tunisian revolution started. Absolutely unpredictable. People had immolated themselves previously in Tunisia, and it had no effect at all. You couldn't have gone around giving boxes of matches to people in Tunisia as a kind of, as a well-planned development intervention, thinking that you could predict that one of those was going to cause the revolution. It was completely unpredictable. That changes the way you work, because if you can't predict something, you have to get much better at spotting when it happens and reacting to it. So that's a different mindset to, I have this great 5-year plan which I'm going to implement. So cause and effect are the exception, not the rule. And a lot of change actually involves conflict. NGOs, at least in the UK, are basically nice people. We don't like fighting. If we liked fighting, we would become football supporters and not be NGOs. And yet, a lot of change involves conflict and constant power struggles and renegotiation of power, not laying out your research, showing that you're right, and expecting people to change what they do, which is actually, bizarrely, the model of change of a lot of the aid industry. So what that means for the way we think is that we have to have this constant cycle in our minds. We have to have a real clear sense of power analysis, which is the jargon for how is the power that influences or stops this kind of change we seek distributed? What are the kinds of coalitions which might push it, or the coalitions that might block it? How might that change? Are we going to have to wait for Robert Mugabe to die before we get change in Zimbabwe? Very reasonable change hypothesis. Or could we actually do something using pressure from donors? Or what else could we do? You then think about how those things might change, and then you decide what you can do. Oxfam, whoever else, we could do a campaign to get donors to put more pressure on Robert Mugabe, or whatever else. And then you have to constantly assume that you're going to be wrong. Okay, your basic assumption, it's a bit like being a scientist. Your basic assumption when you're doing science is that you're trying to disprove everything. That's kind of how we should think more in development too. You should evaluate constantly, try things out, recognize failures, and change when you recognize failures. None of those things happen regularly at the moment. So all of this is contained in vast detail in the book we're launching on Tuesday, Monday? Monday, thank you. And it's been published globally next week as well. But blogging is much more fun, and you can answer back, whereas you can't answer back to a book. So if you want to get on the blog, come and have an argument, that would be great. Thanks very much.